right, thank you everyone for joining. We will let people trickle in over the next couple of minutes and we'll get started here shortly. Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll give just 1 or 2 more minutes for people to enter, and we'll be starting soon. Thank you. All righty, we'll get started. People will be trickling in over the next few minutes, but I'm excited to get going. So thank you for joining, everyone. My name is Derek Stenclik. I'm a founding partner of Telos Energy. We are an analytics and engineering firm specializing in grid planning. But I'm a longtime collaborator with ESIG and really happy to be here and kick off this webinar. So on behalf of ESIG, I want to welcome you to their monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you who are not familiar with ESIG, they're a member-based nonprofit organization providing members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy systems integration decisions. ESIG does this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials like the demand response report that we will be covering today. ESIG is also in a leadership role of the Global Power Systems Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission it is to bring together key actors to catalyze rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. ESIG's workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I do recommend and encourage you to follow up if you'd like what you hear and think you'll be pleasantly surprised about becoming a member of ESIG. But again, this presentation, this webinar will be available publicly and able to share. So if you want to hear more, go to their website, esig.energy, and find them on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. So a few quick logistical matters before we get started. Phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For Q&A, though, we do have the Slido platform. So you'll see there, go to slido.com and enter event code ESIG22 as the event code. We are going to be using that quite a bit today. So please go in there if you have a question. We will be working through that. At the top of the hour, we'll wrap it up. It's a relatively short webinar here, and we'll follow up with a link to the video as well as answers to any Q&A that we might have not gotten to from Slido. So for today's topic, I'm really excited. The topic today is barriers and opportunities for demand response participation in wholesale markets. And the webinar today is going to be a little bit different than others that you may have seen from ESIG. We're going to start with a very quick presentation from myself on a new ESIG report, but I will try to keep that quick. The report was a result of a lot of interviews and conversations that we had with industry experts. So rather than me present to you the report, I wanted you to hear from those industry experts directly. So very happy to have Ben, Jill, and Ryan here today to share some of their perspectives. I'll give a quick intro to them here shortly. So please, in the meantime, go ahead and submit questions in Slido, especially again for the second half of this presentation where we will go to Q&A with the panel. And with that, I will switch over to, again, quick presentation to hopefully set the stage for the Q&A and the panel discussion we will have afterwards. All right, so ESIG new report came out a couple months ago around gaps, barriers, and solutions to demand response participation in wholesale markets. We'll drop a link to the report in the chat. But this report really covers current market performance and trends in demand response across the U.S. wholesale markets, talks about gaps in demand response participation, and then also offers potential solutions and a path forward. So again, this report was based off of interviews and kind of primary research with a lot of industry experts, whether aggregators, utilities, ISOs, or researchers. And we have a good, no surprise, we have one person from each of those groups here with us today to share some of their perspectives. But again, to set the stage, this is actually highlighting some work that Ryan did a few years ago, looking at some of the U.S. cost-effective load flexibility potential for the entire U.S. When you think about today, around 6% of peak demand being covered in load flexibility, a lot of that just being interruptible loads, a lot of commercial industrial interruptible loads, a little bit of smart thermostats, but a lot of potential going from today out to 2030 and beyond. And some of that's expanded conventional programs, but a lot of it also going to be coming from new load flexibility programs, new opportunities around rate design and other demand response participation. And then when we think about even further new opportunities around changes in markets, but also changes in the end use load itself. As we bring on more and more electrification, the load inherently becomes potentially more flexible. I do say potentially because there's no guarantee that will happen if we don't have rate design and markets that try to capture it. So where are we today? We start the report with a little bit of background around kind of putting the energy transition in perspective. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the research shows that demand flexibility or load flexibility is going to be a really critical component of the energy transition. But when you compare the growth of load flexibility relative to other aspects, basically generation side of that energy transition, you can see it pales in comparison. So we went back 2013 and said, well, what was the cumulative growth in solar on the left, wind in the middle, and battery storage on the right on a percentage basis from where we were in 2013 relative to the growth in demand response. And you can see, obviously, the scale is different across each of those plots. But what it shows is we see exponential growth in solar, wind, and battery storage, but flat or declining growth in load flexibility and demand response, despite kind of all the research showing it's really a critical component of the energy transition, especially as we go to more and more shares or higher and higher shares of variable renewable energy. So another way to look at that is to look at participation of demand response capacity in wholesale markets. So this is looking specifically at demand response that is showing up and participating in the wholesale ISO markets across the US. And what you see is there's obviously this is showing in gigawatts of total capacity entering into those markets. And you can see there's different levels in each, but similar trends. You see either flat or in some cases even declining growth in demand response that's being offered into the market. Now this is one half of the equation. This is wholesale demand response, again, directly offering into the ISO markets. There's another bundle of demand response that is retail programs that doesn't necessarily show up in these charts, but I think it's indicative. We're seeing relatively flat growth. If you look at it on a US ISO, across all of the ISOs, the dotted line here, as a percentage of peak demand, about 6.5%, a little under 7% of peak demand being covered by demand response. And then you can see on a relative basis who kind of the regions that have relatively more demand response and other ones that have relatively less. The other thing you see is it's pretty volatile. This is moving around significantly from year to year, market to market. And a lot of that is a function of several things, really. One is market rules are changing over time, right? And you'll see fluctuations across some of these ISOs that are inherent just because the way the market accredits or some of the other market rules around how demand response can participate are changing over time. And so some of that fluctuation is there. The other piece of it is demand response is fundamentally today, in most cases, a capacity resource. So most of that participation is being offered into capacity markets, which are inherently volatile as well. And so you get some fluctuations in participation there as well. Keep an eye out. Most of these ISOs are undergoing accreditation reforms around demand response. So I suspect over the next couple of years, you will see continued volatility around how some of that accreditation plays out. The key thing here is pretty flat across the board, again, with some regions being higher or lower than others, but on net, flat demand response growth in different markets. Have another view of that, looking at participation at both wholesale and retail levels. And again, this is looking at customers enrolled in retail demand response programs, so not necessarily directly offering into the wholesale market, but being provided into utility programs at the load serving entity at the retail level. And you can see a little bit different variation around that. But again, disparate. You see some states significantly higher than others, but again, on net, right around that 6, 7, 8% number. So the report covers 5 gaps. We'll touch on these throughout the discussion, but the report goes through each of these gaps, talks about why we see it as a gap. Again, these came up across interviews with ISO staff members, utility planners, researchers, and aggregators, and kind of these are the common threads we heard throughout all of those discussions. The first is just a lack of experience and knowledge, on both sides of the coin. This is the end use customer has a lack of experience and knowledge, but also kind of some of the market designers or utility designers of experience around new technologies that are coming into play and some of the metering requirements and interconnection requirements that go with that. Second is around market fragmentation and inconsistent rules. So one of the biggest things we heard when talking to aggregators was it wasn't so much the market rules that were the problem, it was the inconsistencies and the continuous changing of those market rules and the fact that every market has very disparate rules. So while we have some homogeneity around interconnection rules for supply side resources, we don't see those similarities on the demand response. And so that fragmentation across markets is also very difficult to build business models around. Some of that goes into point number 3 around difficult interconnection and metering rules, especially as new technologies come online and we have behind the meter storage or EVs, which have their own inverters or communication devices, but sometimes requirements around interconnection and metering, layering on an additional layer of complexity on top of that. The fourth is around, I kind of touched on it, but accreditation and a lot of the demand response being a capacity resource. Well, really understanding how the resource is responding during grid emergency events or during supply deficiencies is lacking, and really just a need for good performance data during grid events to both build confidence in the resource, but also make sure we're accrediting it correctly so we don't see that volatility from year to year. And then lastly, fundamentally, weak financial incentives. And some of that's just due to the nature of this being a distributed resource that's in aggregate a lot of capacity, but it's spread out across a lot of end users. And so there's not always enough money to get the right response from the end use ratepayers, but also weak financial incentives around just not having, most consumers not being on time-varying pricing or real-time pricing, or having that real-time pricing too. So with that, I do want to switch over here to discussion shortly. The report does go over solutions to each of those gaps. So we're not just complaining in the report. We try to come up with recommendations or solutions. And then I did have, again, we'll post these slides, tried to give an update of where the report was written 6 months ago versus today and where we're seeing kind of some of the demand response headed. I think opportunities around data center, potential data center flexibility, and bringing that into the demand response equation is almost, is going to be critical on whether or not that is feasible. And just with the rapid pace of load growth and the tightening supply across the country, demand response is really going to need to step up, because at the end of the day, it's one of the few resources that is going to be able to integrate fast enough to meet some of those load growth challenges. And then on headwinds, just some of the direct competition with battery storage, right? The 2 to 4 hour demand response is competing directly in some cases with utility scale battery storage. And then as we see risk shift, resource adequacy risk shift over time into evenings and overnight, and also into winter seasons, kind of our conventional demand response that we've always kind of built around the summer peak evenings is starting to change. And so our demand response programs are going to have to change with that over time. So with that, I will invite Jill, Ryan, and Ben to hop on. I'm going to, someone from the ESIG side can kind of remove the slide, but in the meantime, folks, go to slido.com, go to ESIG and put in ESIG 22. I'll invite our 3 panelists here to join me. Thank you for hopping on. I really appreciate your time today. Again, the report was a compilation of a lot of interviews and discussions we had with industry experts. So we have 3 of them here today, really provided a lot of insight into that report and a lot of good recommendations. So first, Jill Powers, she's the Demand Response and Distributed Energy Resource Senior Manager at for CAISO's Wholesale Markets. We have an ISO representative. We have Ben Pickard, who manages strategy and M&A for U.S. demand response and VPP markets for CPower. They are a leading DER aggregator. So we got the aggregator representative. And then we got Ryan Hledik, who's a principal at the Brattle Group. He's an industry thought leader on DER and demand response and load flexibility more generally. And he's also an author of kind of a sister report to this one in partnership with LBNL, kind of released at a very similar time. So with that, I will switch over to some Q&A. And again, we'll have this more of a discussion than a presentation like ESIG typically has. And I see people are already starting to put Q&A into Slido. So thank you. Please vote up the questions you want to see, and we'll switch over to that shortly. So Jill, Ben, Ryan, thank you for joining. I'll say, despite the growing need for capacity and flexible resources that I alluded to, that, like I showed, the markets are flat or declining. I guess of the 5 gaps presented in the report, which do you think is most pressing? And with that, maybe I'll throw it to Ryan to start, because you had a similar report come out around demand response and wholesale markets. So what did you find? Do those 5 gaps kind of track with some of your findings, and which one of those do you think is the most pressing that we need to address?
Sure. Yeah. So, and first, Derek, congratulations to you and ESIG for putting out a great report. Definitely recommend that everyone on the call read that. I'm still working through it myself because there's so much great information there, but just wanted to quickly shout out what a great job you did there. I think all 5 barriers that you identified, all 5 challenges, definitely align with what we've seen in our research on the topic. So I think it's hard to pick one just because I think all 5 are such critical barriers. I think the one that I would pick to comment on first is the challenge around lack of education, lack of knowledge, and I think that is a challenge. But I think really the question is kind of what is the root cause of that lack of understanding, right? Like why don't we have sort of across the board a better understanding of demand response and how to get it to work? And I think the reason for that is for a long time, demand response has always been thought of as kind of this sideshow, something that's nice to pilot, something that is, we should try and accommodate if we can, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to tip the scales. It's not going to make or break the system. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, I think you alluded to it at the end of your comments, Derek, but we have now reached a point where with supply chain constraints, with interconnection queue delays, with all of the uncertainty that has just been introduced by tariffs and new kind of macroeconomic policy, we aren't going to in the future, I think, be able to depend on just kind of traditional supply side resources to meet load growth in the way that we have been able to historically. They're still going to play a huge role in addressing the nation's energy needs, but not in as dominant of a fashion as we've seen in the past. So what that means is I think we are right now moving out of a situation where we can think of demand response as just something that's kind of nice to have on the side in emergency conditions, and really a resource that we're going to need to use at a more significant level and more frequently in order to keep the lights on. And so I think my hope is just almost organically that the challenge we have around, we're going to have to work at it, but the challenge we have around knowledge and understanding is going to be addressed as the industry comes to appreciate that demand response is going to play such an important role in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Really, really helpful, informative. I guess building on that, Jill, a question for you at the CAISO, and CAISO is probably in a better situation than a few others. You're going into the summer, I think, in a better position than you have been in previous years in terms of the supply mix. But are you seeing the same challenges around the impending supply crunch? And what is the CAISO? How does the CAISO view demand response and load flexibility in general about meeting some of those coming challenges?
Eric, I think obviously we've really come a long way since some of those supply crunches that we had back in 2020 during our high heat events in the Labor Day time frame, and we've learned a lot from that, and we've advanced our capabilities in trying to obtain additional emergency response kind of support from a demand flexibility side. Now, we didn't see, and I think your report highlighted, in terms of those within the market, participation within the market, we have seen it kind of tail off. There's a variety of different reasons with respect to that. We have done a lot in the past few years since 2020 in terms of getting a better understanding of the actual performance and capability of these type of resources, and really kind of refining how we're determining what the capabilities are in terms of a response to a market dispatch. But what we also opened up was this other opportunity, and programs were developed through the CPUC and CEC as to emergency load response capabilities and demand side grid support. So we did see a growth kind of in that area, and recognizing that there is this potential there, and there is a good load flexibility potential that we're starting to understand those capabilities a little bit more of. Now, how we can kind of move those into maybe a more integrated and potentially market integrated and compensated type of role, those are things that we're working on. Now, we have heard a lot of these different barriers from our stakeholders. We opened up a stakeholder working group this year, and one of the top priority items, and this gets back to your barriers, was really on performance measurement and also the metering constructs that we currently have. So those are one of our top priorities to kind of dig into, find out where we need to go in expanding our capabilities and abilities, and potentially one of the barriers is kind of across the ISOs and RTOs, a consistent measurement and verification of the performance of these type of resources, as well as expanding our use of different types of metering, maybe device level metering, behind the meter metering. So that's kind of where we're at, top priority in terms of where our stakeholders want us to focus our attention.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I'm going to come back to some of your comments about the different programs across the state, because I think that's really unique and one of the things we teed up in the report. But before I do that, I want to build on this metering and interconnection and kind of the discussion you got from some of the stakeholders of the request. Ben, I don't know if you were one of the specific stakeholders, but I imagine CPower has been submitting similar comments in similar jurisdictions, and just the aggregator community in general flagged some of these metering challenges and just interconnection and measurement and verification. Can you talk a little bit about, if you could kind of wave a magic wand and your ideal metering and verification, what would that look like, and how should we think about that from a market side of balancing ease of implementation at the aggregator side with the need for visibility and in some cases controllability at the ISO side? So what do you look for? How do you kind of balance some of those, not competing needs, but sometimes
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Thanks, Derek. And first, just want to echo what Ryan was saying about how great this report is pulling up a lot of really important dynamics going on that I think are particularly interesting, juxtaposed against some of the other through lines that you hear around virtual power plants and demand response. I use those words somewhat interchangeably in terms of their potential, right? And how much pain is coming, how much pain is already here, and how VPPs and DR are a perfect solution for them. I think I definitely had, gap number 3 with a side of number 2 would have been my answer. So I'm that sort of difficult interconnection and metering rules, which are also inconsistent, right, across ISOs. And I think if you hear someone talking sort of at the highest level about, you have all this rising prices, bill pressure, extreme weather, renewables that where load needs to be sort of the thing that is throttled to fit rather than fossil generation that can move up and down at will. All these dynamics that lend themselves to load flexibility, right? So you have this demand for this stuff, and then on the other side, I think what you'll hear and see is that there are all of these resources that are coming to market that have these VPP capabilities and are being purchased and installed for reasons that have very little to do with their actual grid flexibility. So it may be convenience, it may just be someone wants an electric vehicle or a smart thermostat or a better heating system. And so you have this upwelling of DERs at the same time as you have this tremendous upwelling of grid need, and VPP should be the thing that meshes those together and creates a much better system overall. Where I think we'd want to see some improvement is very specifically on this metering side, because a lot of those devices have smooth customer experiences and make it very easy for a consumer who has very little technical knowledge to do a lot of things with, just via their phone, right? What makes that hard and where you have a lot of drop off is where there are, integrations with existing systems that could be the utility customer information system or meter data management system, coupled with rules around compliance for settlements of grid services performance and enrollment, where there's just a ceiling on how sort of seamless and frictionless that can be. And the more that we can do to identify and eliminate that friction, the more we're going to be able to tap into that huge technical available market of DERs. I don't know that there's a single silver bullet there, but I think some of the areas certainly that we've seen are creating not just deploying AMI is generally not enough. Even deploying a green button as a sort of blanket label is often not enough. California has done a really good job of implementing a green button that is fairly uniform across the utilities, and I think is still pushing in that direction. And where there's a conscious ability to share that data securely with third parties like aggregators who can abstract that complexity away from the customer and still deliver value to that customer and to the grid. And so that would be an example of a place where identifying a point of friction for that end user that can who can benefit the overall system and taking real steps to eliminate it. I think there's dozens of others, and they all circle back to, well, what's the system that we have to retrofit to? How robust is that AMI architecture of some utility and some other geography, right? And what constraints does that introduce? So unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet, but I think taking that approach of eliminating friction so that we can grab all of these new users and new DERs that are coming into market is how we're all going to win and deliver a better, more flexible energy system.
Great. And I'll maybe quickly throw that back to Jill. It sounds like you're hearing similar things from what Ben is saying. What are you trying to do on the balancing side of kind of streamlining that data sharing and ease of implementation with what I imagine on your side is verification, quantification, making sure the payments are kind of as accurate as possible? What are you doing to kind of facilitate or manage that balancing act?
I think we're just at this stage, very early on in our working group and speaking with our stakeholders, which Ben is one of our stakeholders, in understanding what this problem statement is and where it really hits the ISO's either processes, rules, jurisdiction. Some of it may be even outside of the ISO's jurisdiction, because Ben is speaking to some of the data sharing that's happening outside of the ISO. But there's requirements that we have in terms of how the resources are registered. And so we're looking at kind of parsing out, understanding the full problem statement, parsing out where we have touch points within our own processes and our, market, I wouldn't quite say market design, but really in our participation model, rules and processes to determine where we can have the largest impact. One of them is, within our metering. So we do have some, can we recognize different types of metering information? And I think it's been brought up, maybe some statistical data, the information, utilization, statistical analysis. I think one thing that we, and I'd like to dig in a little bit more in terms of understanding is our focus is on settlement of these within the market, energy settlement of these type of resources within the participation within the markets and the services that they're providing. Telemetry hasn't been as critical in terms of that participation because we don't see, and this may be, another kind of problem statement that we need to kind of dig into a little bit more. the flexibility for provision of services that might require more of the telemetry, real-time information exchange. We've never really been able to see an uplift of the provision of that type of flexibility, which we think is there and maybe even growing with respect to the type of behind-the-meter technologies that we're seeing integrate onto our system. So that one has been less of our focus in terms of with our stakeholders. And so again, going back to some of the fundamental rules that we have started with, seeing if we can move beyond where we started with in terms of recognition of the different types of measurement devices, different types of metering that might allow us with a certain amount of understanding of, how this could affect reducing the barriers for different types of technologies to come into the space.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jill. Really appreciate some of that background and good coordination there across you and Ben and some of those responses. Really interesting to hear that. I want to go back to something Jill brought up earlier around the different programs in California. I'll kind of ask this to Ryan and then maybe get into a few of the specifics with Jill. But when we were doing this research for the project, I was constantly juggling the retail programs that the load serving entities are handling, and then the demand response that's being offered directly into the ISO markets. And I remember at one point I was going over your report, Ryan, and I saw like a footnote that said, yeah, here's our number, but there might be some double counting between retail and wholesale programs. And we really don't know how big that double counting is. And to me, it was a little bit of a relief because it was like, okay, I'm not looking at this wrong. But it was also like, ooh, we probably need some better data here, just across the board, not specific to any region. So I guess, how have you viewed this? And some of that double counting is not double counting, sorry. Some of that redundancy is intentional. It's value stacking, selling into both distribution programs and then also wholesale programs. And there's mechanisms to make sure there's no double counting there. But how do you handle this from the research side? But also, what do you think is the right mix? Is it good to have both programs? Should we be trying to get all of the retail programs into the wholesale market? Should we be trying to go the other direction? How do you view this challenge?
Yeah, so first, yeah, that's a real thorn in my side, not being able to say, here is exactly how many gigawatts of demand response we have in the US. I really hope eventually between EIA data and FERC data and kind of the efforts to develop all of that, there will be a way to get to that number. But it has, for a number of years now, we've had kind of the two separate reports and have just needed to acknowledge that there's some degree of overlap there. How much is a bit unknown. And yeah, rest assured, Derek, I have dug into that, and the answer isn't out there. We've tried to find it. But it does highlight, like you were saying, kind of the bigger conceptual issue of dual participation in retail programs that are, say, more designed to allow participants to capture the distribution value of demand flexibility, and then wholesale programs that capture that bulk system value. Particularly, I think when we're talking about, as Ben was saying, like residential programs, EVs, behind the meter batteries, smart thermostats that are controlling heating and cooling, being able to stack those value streams is pretty important to making the economics of all of this work out, because metering and telemetry is more expensive if you're going out and trying to do that for resources that are going to give you a couple kilowatts of demand reduction rather than a couple megawatts, right? So the economics, the economic equation just changes. And to me, the answer is we do need both. I mean, CAISO is not, you don't monetize distribution value in the CAISO markets, you monetize that with the distribution utilities that are responsible for that. I think there are some good examples of progress having been made in this area when we've been doing, like you have, Derek, and going out conducting interviews. A lot of folks we've spoken with have pointed to New York and Con Ed in particular as a utility that's figured out how to set up a program that is designed to provide distribution value. It's called their DLRP and CSRP programs in New York, but in a way that clearly defines parameters around what it takes to participate and earn revenue in those programs. and still sort of establishes guidelines for allowing those same resources to participate in the wholesale market. So my, I guess, short answer to your question is I do think we're always going to need both. Demand response is a very heterogeneous resource. The customers participating in these programs are heterogeneous. Some will have preferences for the way utility programs are designed. Some will have preferences for the way aggregator programs and wholesale markets are designed. But ultimately, to stack all of this value, coordination across the two and a set of programs that allow you to do that is pretty critical.
Yeah, thank you. Really helpful, and kind of with some of that heterogeneity, both on kind of the end users and the end uses of demand response, but also heterogeneity in the markets themselves, both at the distribution level, wholesale level, and then across ISOs. One of the things that kept coming up, and I think one of my favorite quotes of all the interviews, I can't remember, Ben, if it was from you or one of the other aggregators, but we'll give you credit. I asked, is there a market you like more, right? And we said this is to an aggregator, and said, well, what's your favorite market? Is there one of the ISOs that you really like working in? And they said PJM right away. I said, oh, what about PJM's market rules are so good? And like, no, it's not specifically the market rules. It's just a really big market with the same market rules. And it wasn't so much that they had a good market. It was just a big market, you're 150, 60 gigawatts plus with a uniform set of rules. And that was actually more important than the rules themselves. And so can you talk a little bit, like as an aggregator, when you look at both inconsistent rules across the ISOs, but also inconsistent rules across the different utilities? And another quote that came up was, we're getting killed by death of pilot programs. Like the pilot programs are good, but every pilot program is unique, and we have to come up with a customized solution, and it's really expensive and time consuming to go do that. So as an aggregator, how do you view this heterogeneity across the markets, both at the retail and wholesale, and what could, I guess, really what could FERC do, or what could we do as an industry to better streamline some of that, or bring some harmonization across those?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I'm glad I had those qualifiers at the back. I mean, we have Jill on the phone, and you're saying that I like another ISO better than California. It's a little awkward, but I'm going to roll with it. So absolutely. I think when there's a dimension that you brought out in your discussion about the value of, say, fixed prices versus something that operates more on a market principle. Most of the ISO DR programs tend to operate more on some kind of market mechanism. But I think the other dimension of what really creates investment and activity from the private sector in these grid balancing, load flexibility opportunities is just the breadth and the longevity of a market and a market opportunity. And so, to that point, when you look at PJM and you have 150 gigawatts in a market that's been around there for a long time, not only are we our customers signing up because they know it's been there and it's been around, but aggregators and the private sector in general is able to look at that and say, well, we know this is going to be here, and we know that it covers a wide geography with lots of different types of DERs and lots of different types of customers in it. So we can think about how we push out that circle and figure out ways to incorporate more and more resources into these markets. And so, I think we talked about Resi and CPower is C&I focused. We think that there are a lot of advantages as well. We're not picking favorites. There's benefits to both Resi and C&I, but we've been able to figure out ways to bring residential resources into that PJM market, despite the fact that it's not particularly designed for that, right? Whereas, and you contrast that with, say, a bespoke utility program that's hiring a single vendor to go and run a Resi-focused demand response program, which is also good, right? But in our view, has less room for creativity among a range of market actors that might include aggregators, that might include device OEMs that want to experiment with business model expansion and things like that. So more of an ecosystem to bring in. So the size of that market is great, and I think maybe some of the elements that folks might want to consider when they're thinking about policy, and this is certainly not I'm not a policymaker, but it is to spend more time thinking about those best practices and sharing those. There are certainly specific areas where, you know, one grid will have very specific needs. California has a lot more solar than PJM and has some very specific itches to scratch when it comes to what VPPs and DERs do for the state of California, for example, that don't appear other places. But, you know, things like how does baselining work, right? How does giving DERs and VPPs credit for their performance? Is there a way to look at what's working in other markets and think about creating singular standards? I think a lot of that just takes a lot of time and resources that often, you know, folks are stretched to be able to do. And DR is very high potential, but it's also a very small part of the stack. So you know, not casting any stones at all. I think it's just an area where it would be great to be able to dig in further, and you know, we stand ready to help support that if we can.
And hopefully,
yeah,
well,
yeah, I hope too, with the efforts that we're doing in expanding our market services across the West and expanding to multiple states. You know, we have an additional 11 states. I mean, we started very, you know, with our market participation and market services just to this state of California and some within our balancing area and those loads within our balancing area. But now with this expansion, I hope Ben is going to see a lot more, you know, capabilities and opportunities within this wider reach. But there still is, and I would say, yes, there's the inconsistencies across the ISOs, but now that we're moving into a multi-state, there's a lot of differences in the approaches from the different states and the different state regulatory bodies that were, again, this is part of the efforts that the ISO is undertaking to kind of bring in that fold to start harmonizing across those states as to how they might be able to provide services within our markets, our extended day ahead market, which will be coming in 26, as well as the current capabilities under our real-time and balance markets throughout the West. So hopefully we'll get, you know, the increases and additional, you know, efforts that you can undertake within the overall Western region.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jill, and appreciate you jumping in there. I'll actually ask for Ryan also to jump in on some of this topic, because I think your perspective, you know, from a consulting view of being able to do the big national studies like the ones I referenced, but also drop into specific utilities or specific states. I know you just came out with the New York Live Flexibility Assessment and have dropped into specific utilities in specific states. I guess as you're doing that, are you seeing similarities that should be kind of brought up to the top, or are you seeing some folks that are doing things in a very specific way that we could try to replicate and make more harmonized across the different markets?
Yeah, and I mean, there's probably not a short answer to that question, but I mean, I can tell you in some of our research, when we have been trying to, you know, dig in and understand what is it that creates a successful program or a, you know, a demand response or VPP offering that's really reached scale, it seems like there are typically kind of three ingredients. One is like healthy compensation. That's kind of the obvious one. It needs to be in the customer's interest to enroll. The second is ease of enrollment. That is, it's a huge barrier if customers need to like fax forms into their utility to sign up versus just like checking a box when they're buying their thermostat, right? So ease of enrollment, streamlined enrollment process is the second. The third one, and it's kind of a harder one to define because it's kind of more behavioral in nature, but it's kind of a degree of trust in that enrolling in this program doesn't mean that they're like handing their life over to Ben and he's going to be pressing the button on the demand response program 4 times a day to control their air conditioner, right? When customers sign up for these programs, they understand that they're giving something up and that's why they're being compensated. But there needs to be a level of trust with their service provider that they're in this together, and you know, it's going to be like an acceptable level of participation. And I think that third one is important and maybe the more challenging aspect in all of this to try and establish. But those are, I think, the three legs of the stool as we've seen them.
That's great. Love it. Also, got me thinking about my own participation in demand response programs and time of use rates. And yeah, when I got my EV, having to send my license and my registration and 3 forms and 3 different steps on the enrollment was a barrier. And I'm really interested in this. I couldn't imagine if I wasn't interested in this, if I'd go through with it. And then on the back end, like you said, trust and knowing, like I look at the bill and I'm not even sure what my rate is off peak versus on peak. And it's really hard for me to disentangle some of that. So certainly again, we're steeped in this day in, day out, but if you're not, it's a pretty big barrier of overcoming that. So I'm going to switch gears. We got 12 minutes left. I'm going to switch over to the Slido, and I'm going to also try to combine some of my questions with Slido ones as I'm going through this. So if you're on Slido, please go in and vote some up so we can, there's 33 or 37 questions. We'll try to get to the ones that have the most votes. We'll do a little bit more of a speed round. The first one from Paulo around demand side resources thrived, especially through reliability services in capacity markets. And do you think this is the best way to support the development of the demand side? And we have a figure in the report that shows, I think it's PJM, like 95% of revenues come from the capacity market, and probably a unique perspective at Jill and kind of the state programs in the CPUC around demand response. But traditionally, demand response has been analogous with capacity. And we've seen that be volatile in both price and accreditation. Do we think capacity is still the best end use? And is there a role for a little bit more revenue certainty or long-term contracts or things like that? So I'll just open that one up. Maybe we'll do a speed round if we want to hit all 3 on that, because I do think it's important. And I just said I wouldn't do that. So Ben, hit it off. Sorry, Jill.
I think I can just start off as that's what we see, that, the greatest, we're not just seeing these type of resources coming to our markets to provide energy services, ancillary services, or even some of our flexible ramping products. It's really tied to that capacity value. So I think the only thing from the ISO standpoint, there is an understanding that there is untapped load flexibility that is out there. And we often too wonder if, is there a different mechanism? And we've, again, seen it with particularly these emergency responsive type demand response programs that have set up since 2020, that there is, and, there is room for finding different types of compensation mechanisms. And I'll just throw that.
Real quick on that, California has a really unique, they've got the CPUC supply side demand response that's offering into the CPUC programs. There's I'm going to butcher the name, the demand side or the load modifying resources that are being handled mostly by the load serving entities that kind of change the load shape. And then there's this third bucket that Jill's referring to, which is administered through the CEC, which is this kind of like resource of last resort that's just providing demand response as an emergency only kind of resource. And people that participate, they get compensated if they show up, but if they don't, like there's no penalty. There's no requirement that they enroll as kind of this last resort. So I probably summarized that poorly, but I think that's a unique thing of California and would encourage people to take a look at that. But yeah, Ryan, on the capacity market question, is this still the best option and how do you respond?
Short answer is yes. I mean, I think it really aligns well with what a lot of demand response resources can provide. And in the new environment of rapid load growth and really tightening supply and demand conditions across a lot of systems, there's renewed interest in how can we get creative about providing resource adequacy. So I think the short answer is yes. Where we have seen interest around DR evolving, particularly in states like California, is on, as we've discussed, distribution level benefits. And if distribution utilities are starting to become the bottleneck in achieving like the state's transportation electrification goals because the system just can't be built out fast enough under current regulatory constructs to keep up with that, then demand response potentially has really important kind of local applications there as well.
Yeah, Ben, you probably steeped in this maybe the most.
Yeah, so I think capacity has been a draw for a reason, right? the concept called load duration curve, which probably a lot of folks are familiar with on this call, but the idea that for the top 50 hours, sometimes even less, you're creating extra 10, 20, 30% capacity requirement, right? And so some peaker plant has to earn back all of its carrying costs on just a few hours a year. So the price signal is quite strong there. And it's quite a deep market, right? And so that capacity requirement is the same as the peak capacity, or more or less as the coincident peak of that grid. And so it's a big market, really good price signal for relatively short dispatch for our customers. I think it makes a difference that the reason why they're enrolling is for the cash, but it's also for the idea that we're going to keep the grid up, and to get paid to move out a shift or respond to other automatically dispatch or respond to a demand response event on the capacity side is a great trade relative to losing power for hours or even days outside of your control, right? And help your community. And so I think there are a lot of good reasons why capacity is an anchor. I think we've seen programs that do want to create that long-term investable price signal. The CT Pura battery incentive in California, in Connecticut, in another C state, California, the DSGS programs also provide price certainty. And I think there's some uncertainty about the time horizon of those programs, but the idea is certainly there, right? In terms of, well, let's put out the signal so people can actually invest against it. I think that both of them serve purposes. But just to Ryan's point about distribution level value, completely agree. I think the way that CPower's approach it, I thought about it is there's a difference between sort of getting a demand response resource up and into the system and part of the solution, part of a VPP, and then expanding its range of applications so that it can respond to more parts of the value stack. And I think capacity is really good because it's the coincident peak of an ISO, covers a huge geography, and folks like CPower can go out and market to a lot of different segments and grab a lot of different resources. Distribution level constraints are often very geographically specific. And so it's really hard to go and market or spin up a business that just focuses on, say one substation or one feeder. But if you have these large aggregations that are already, you're talking with and activating, it could be through CPower, or it could be through, an auto OEM or someone else. Suddenly those distribution level value streams aren't so far away to unlock. And I think thinking about these things sequentially or in combination is really powerful.
Great. We probably have time for just one more question. The next one is I'm glad it made it to the top of the list, around data center load growth and demand response flexibility from data centers. This is the 800-pound gorilla in capacity markets and just in electricity markets in general, so it's getting a lot of attention. How realistic is it? Is it driven by cost reductions? I'll pause real quick. Shameless plug, ESIG has a full large load task force underway. The resource adequacy one is going to be covering this quite closely. So if you're interested in that and an ESIG member, please reach out. But yeah, on the data center side, I view this as almost a necessity. I don't think it's going to be costs that factor into it. I think it's more on time. If we can accelerate interconnection in exchange for some flexibility, I think we might get some traction. But Ben, I know you're probably talking to these data centers and customers about their participation. What are you hearing? Is it realistic?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to make the point that like I was saying, I think the data summarized in this report and the overall trend is right on. And you mentioned the constraint in the data. Going to 2023, since then we've seen really strong price signals kind of pop up in more and more grids. And so already this constraint coming from an expectation of load growth from years of low prices in many of these markets is now unwinding in a very dramatic way. And I'd be really curious as we roll forward, right, and we get more data available, whether you start to see this, the megawatts, the Q increase, as well as like this. We know that the P is increasing, so the overall market size must be going up. But to directly answer your question, sorry, I just wanted to make sure and not lose that point. I think we've seen a range of responses from data centers. I think you're absolutely right that it is dawning on grids and data centers that really want to they want slops any way they can get them. So far it hasn't been around how do I do this most efficiently from a grid perspective. But I think the idea of flexible interconnection requirements is a way to move up in queues. We're seeing that. Jill probably knows this better than I do, but seeing that in California, seeing that in Arizona, and I think seeing that in places like Ireland, right, where there are flexibility requirements for data centers, and I think it's just a matter of time before there's more participation across the board. But we're already seeing plenty of flexibility in other areas of data center use and flexible compute. Really depends on the use case, but there's always a way to be part of the solution, and we're certainly seeing that across our customer base.
Awesome. And with the last, Ryan and then Jill, you want to kind of round us out?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I mean, what we've seen is there's a lot of variability in terms of different types of data centers' ability to flex their load. What's common across most data centers is that they need backup generation. And so kind of my pitch here is I hope that as we're rushing to connect data centers, we aren't investing in 50 gigawatts of backup diesel generation, and instead are putting backup, on-site generators behind data centers. Could be gas, could be some combination of solar and storage where there's a large enough physical footprint that we can tap into those resources for services other than just backup and actually provide flexibility to the grid that way. That's the 50 gigawatt opportunity that we have, but that's going to close really quickly if we aren't making those types of decisions now.
And Jill, what is the CAISO seeing with the data centers? How are you feeling?
Yeah, we're seeing them starting to knock on the door. We're still trying to determine, what the overall impact is going to be. We know that there's going to be some load growth in this area. We're there to serve the load. Now, if the flexibility comes into play, and we're trying to determine, to understand, learning from others, what those flexibility capabilities are, and whether or not they're going to be coming to us direct, or if they are going to be coming to us through different types of programs. At this point in time, we're kind of have some dependency on it. Really is coming in at the distribution level. So assuming that those will come to us through distribution, utility programs, and just again, it is on our radar. It is part of our overall looking at enhancement to our demand and distributed energy market integration options, and enhancements to our participation models. So that's kind of where it sits today. Be learning a lot more in the next couple of years, and making changes and adjustments based on what we learn.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Jill, Ben, Ryan, really appreciate your time, both on this panel, but also in the interviews that went into the report. So thank you very much. We have a lot of questions we did not get to. We'll try to filter through those. I'll send that around, and we'll get back to everybody as soon as possible. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and I hope you got a lot out of this as much as I did. I'm sure we could have gone for quite a bit longer. But again, thank you all very much for participating, and special thanks to Ben, Jill, and Ryan.
Thank you.
Rest of your day.
Derek,
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.